It's great to be up here on this pulpit. I have to say that Emily and Jen and I offered this mapping the trees as a gentle invitation, not an attack. But in any case, whatever it was, I'm glad that it resulted in this opportunity to talk to you today about trees and spirituality. I'll start out with a quote from Hermann Hesse, the great German writer, and I think he really guides us in realizing that trees and spirituality are very well suited to be thought of together. He wrote, "For me, trees have always been the most penetrating preachers. Trees are sanctuaries. Whoever knows how to speak to them, whoever knows how to listen to them, can learn the truth. They preach the ancient law of life." I'm at this pulpit this morning because of the deep connections that I and many others have with trees. I've spent my professional life studying trees and learned how trees provide animals and humans with many, many values and many services. The oxygen that we breathe, the nesting places for birds, the flowers for pollinators, shade, drugs to treat our diseases, and the beauty that we capture collectively in art and music. But as with many of you, I'm increasingly aware that these values are simply not adequate or not important enough for us to adequately protect and sustain the trees and other parts of nature that live on our planet. We've tended to base our efforts in conservation of trees on aesthetic values, on economic values, on ecological values, on political values. But still, trees remain subject to deforestation, to fragmentation, and to the ill effects of global climate change. And so, I decided to think that we might need to muster the spiritual values as well as those values to protect trees, to examine the spiritual values that humans hold for trees, and thinking that perhaps if I could articulate those to scientists and non-scientists, that I could be more mindful and allow other people to be more mindful and protective of trees. So this morning I'll speak about the strong links between trees and spirituality, drawing once again on a quote from that wonderful essay of Hermann Hesse's. "In the tree's highest boughs, the world rustles. Their roots rest in infinity. Nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than a beautiful, strong tree." My own affinity with trees began when I was a child, growing up in a fairly large and rather chaotic family. I climbed trees. I really felt like trees were my refuge. They were my sanctuaries. They held me in their limbs and assured me that there are safe and serene places that you can go to if you wish. I have spent my professional life with the scientific studies of trees and how they work. I do research in the forest canopies of Costa Rica and Washington State and teach forest ecology at the University of Utah. My religious background, I think, is appropriate for a Unitarian church. My mother was raised as an Orthodox Jew by parents who emigrated to flee the pogroms of Russia in the early 1900s. My father, who was from India, was raised as a Hindu, and he came here to go to graduate school and stayed. And so in our living room, we had this altar where there was a little image of Ganesha, or Ganapati, the elephant-headed god, and right parked next to it was the menorah. So we sort of had both right there. And of course, our favorite dinner dish was curried bagels. That was always So I just want to let you know that I come here not representing or pushing a single religion, nor certainly as a religious scholar in any way, but rather as a scientist who is deeply committed and deeply passionate to trees and is trying to find any way that I can to help raise awareness to protect them. Before I sort of start into what I'd like to talk about, which is both to discuss the sources of where I've gotten information about trees and spirituality, as well as the conclusions I've gotten from studying this, I'd like to invite you, just for a moment, to envision a tree or a patch of forest that is special to you. It might be a tree like me that I used to climb as a child. It might be a tree that you planted when your child was born. It might be a tree that you planted when your parent died. But just to find in your own mind what that special tree or piece of forest is. And I invite you to close your eyes if you wish, and just to meditate perhaps on a tree you haven't thought about for decades. Thanks. So if you can hold that image in your mind as I speak, we'll come back to that later on as well. Before we discuss trees and spirituality, I just want to make sure we're all talking about spirituality in the same way. The dictionary defines spirituality as the part of a human associated with the minds and feelings as distinguished from the physical body, from the Latin spiritus, breath, and spirare, to breathe. The Dalai Lama, a very spiritual person himself, had another definition, and he says spirituality is about the essence: contentment, caring, sharing, calming, connection. My strategy to try to understand the links between trees and spirituality was to explore the holy writings of all of the world's religions and get references to the scriptures and verses that concern trees and forests that would tell me and followers of that faith and other people about how trees might be categorized by people who wrote those holy scriptures. I started with the obvious Old Testament. When I opened it to the first page, of course, I found this verse, which talks about two important trees. The Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life, also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, that was pretty easy to find a first quote, but what I did then to find all the quotes was I downloaded the Old Testament from the web, and I did a search with the words tree and forest. So I found out all of the quotes that had to do with trees, and it turns out there are 328 references to trees and forests that I categorize them by their different uses or values. And there's a little handout that you can get at the welcome table that has the sort of scientific analysis of that. I also went to the other holy scriptures of other world religions, the Quran, the Talmud, the Gita, the Book of Mormon, and many Buddhist poems and stories. And I did the same thing to extract what was discussed about trees and forests in terms of the spirituality of that particular relationship. I then sat down with all of that material and sort of synthesized and categorized the different ways that trees and spirituality are related, and I'd like to go through these 6. The first one is a very important special one, and that is that trees are connected to truth and to enlightenment. The Old English word for the word tree was troth, which is the same thing as the word truth. So a poet of mine said, so if you meet someone who says he is speaking the truth, look for a strong trunk, look for deep roots, and look for something that sweeps the sky. And I think that is something that we seek when we come to a Unitarian church, or any church for that matter: a strong trunk, deep roots, and something that sweeps the sky. When we think about this, and when we go into a Gothic cathedral, for example, we see that the cathedral itself is tree-like in form, that it brings the eye and the spirit upward to the heavens. And conversely, when we go to visit the tall redwoods of California, we can go visit Cathedral Grove. That's the name of it, because it too is a place where our eyes and our spirits go heavenward. In the Book of Mormon, in 1 Nephi 8, we learn of the dream of Lehi, a tree, and in it is described that Lehi dreamed of a tree with white fruits, with a rod or a fence leading to it, as a symbol of enlightenment to which those followers of that faith are moving toward. We can remember that Buddha sat meditating under the Bodhi tree. When dawn came, the sun brought enlightenment to him after 3 days, and he became the awakened one, spreading his teachings throughout the world. This rootedness of trees and its connection to the sky was beautifully stated, I think, in a poem by the Hindu poet Rabindranath Tagore. Trees are Earth's endless efforts to speak to the listening heaven. There's a wonderful poem by Kenneth Rexroth, who wrote about this connection between trees and truth, trees and spirituality. Buddha took some autumn leaves in his hand and asked Ananda if these were all the red leaves that there were. Ananda answered that it was autumn, and leaves were falling all about them, more than could ever be counted. So Buddha said, I have given you a handful of truths. Besides these, there are many thousands of other truths, more that can even be numbered.